March 18, 1945. Grunewald Forest, western outskirts of Berlin. The wind carried the distant thud of artillery like a slow, uneven heartbeat. Smoke hung low over the treetops, turning the late winter sky the color of bruised steel. From the concrete observation tower, rising above the forest line, the Luftwaffe general lifted his binoculars with hands that had not trembled in years. For months, he had watched the sky burn with bombers and flak. For months, Berlin had lived under a ceiling of fire. This morning, the sky was wrong. Too quiet, too clear, too empty. Then the shimmer appeared. At first it looked like sunlight catching on broken glass. A faint, silver ripple along the western horizon. The general adjusted his grip, narrowing his eyes. The shimmer multiplied, spreading outward like a stain in water. Shapes began to separate from the glare. Sharp wings, long noses, propellers spinning so fast they blurred into invisible discs. They were not bombers. They were fighters. P-51 Mustangs. They poured through the clouds in loose, effortless formation, hundreds of them, glinting like polished knives in the pale light. They flew low, too low for comfort. No escort, no defensive circles, no hesitation, just speed, just dominance. The general felt something tighten in his chest as the count climbed higher and higher. 200, 300, more still following. Berlin was naked beneath them. Radar stations should have been screaming by now. Scramble orders should have been tearing through command lines. Somewhere below, pilots should have been running for cockpits. None of it happened. The communications officer beside him stared at silent equipment with white knuckles. Fuel shortages had grounded most of what remained of the Luftwaffe. Training fields were empty. Operational squadrons existed now only on paper. For the first time since he had pinned the eagle to his chest, the general felt true helplessness. The Mustangs kept coming. Their engines did not roar the way German fighters once had. Their sound was smoother, almost calm, like a tidal current rolling in with impossible certainty. The general realized, with a cold clarity that cut deeper than fear, that this was not an attack formation. There was no bombing altitude, no staggered approach. This was something else. And then, as the first wave crossed directly over the western districts of Berlin, the impossible happened. Nothing fell. No bombs. No gunfire. No explosions. Just the steady thunder of engines passing overhead. The Mustangs swept over rooftops, over shattered factories, over empty flak towers, moving east in a slow, deliberate procession. The general leaned forward, confused, searching for the delayed strike. It never came. Instead, white shapes began drifting down from the sky. At first only a few, then thousands. Paper. Leaflets fluttered through the air like snow, catching in trees, sliding across ruined streets, piling against doorways and sandbags. Soldiers reached up in disbelief. Civilians stepped out from cellars, shielding their eyes as the sky itself seemed to shed skin. The general snapped an order without realizing he had spoken. Retrieval. Immediate. Full collection. Whatever this was, it had meaning. Within minutes, an intelligence officer climbed the tower steps 2 at a time, breathless, one trembling hand clutching a single leaflet. It was not propaganda. It was a map. A precise, chillingly detailed map of Berlin and its surrounding airspace. Every remaining bunker. Every secondary runway. Every camouflaged command post still functioning in secrecy. Routes marked in clean, confident lines. Locations circled that only the inner command knew still existed. Every lie the Reich told itself about what remained hidden was exposed on a single sheet of paper. The general felt the cold move through him like a slow flood. This was not harassment. This was not intimidation. This was disclosure. The enemy was no longer guessing. The enemy no longer needed to search. The Mustangs had already seen everything. The fighters circled once more. Lower this time. The general raised his binoculars again, his breath shallow now, the lenses locked onto one aircraft that passed close enough for him to read the markings along the fuselage. Unit insignia. Squadron identifiers. clean paint, fresh metal. And then he saw something that should not have existed. Numbers that were not yet assigned. Symbols that intelligence files still listed as theoretical. Squadrons whose pilots were officially still in training camps across the Atlantic. The general's mouth went dry. He tracked another aircraft. Then another. The same impossible markings repeated across multiple airframes. These were not just fighters from the present war. These were machines pulled forward from what should have been the future. The enemy was no longer simply winning battles. They were outrunning time. And if stories like this make you feel the weight of what the sky once carried, take a moment now to subscribe to WW2 Never Told German Files and tell us in the comments where you are watching from in the world. These untold moments belong to everyone. The Mustangs banked west as one, climbing with casual grace. No German aircraft rose to challenge them. No flak reached high enough to matter. Fuel reserves were empty. Radar arrays dead. The Luftwaffe, once feared across continents, could do nothing but watch the future turn away without a single shot fired. Hours passed before the full meaning settled into the bones of the city. This had not been a raid. It had been a demonstration. Berlin had not been spared out of mercy. It had been spared because it no longer required destruction. The war, in the sky at least, was already finished. As dusk fell, the general descended the tower alone. The forest swallowed the fading echo of engines. In a sealed folder delivered by a trembling courier, he found intercepted communications stamped with encryption codes he had never seen before. Inside, a single decrypted line waited for him. Air superiority is complete. He stared at the words until the light failed. Slowly, deliberately, he removed the insignia from his collar and set it on the desk. Not in rage, not in despair, in acceptance. Yet even as Berlin prepared for its final days, one question refused to loosen its grip. If the Mustangs had already conquered the sky, why had they spared the city at all? And if this was a message, not a strike, who exactly was it meant for? And if this unfolding realization has you leaning closer to the screen right now, this is the moment to subscribe to WW2 Never Told German Files, because the truth only gets heavier from here. Night folded itself over Berlin like a dark curtain pulled too late. The leaflets still lay across the streets, pressed into the rubble by boots, wind, and the quiet shame of civilians who had begun to understand what had been delivered from a sky. The general remained in his office long after the tower had emptied, long after the last echoes of engines had vanished into memory. The insignia lay where he had placed it. He did not touch it again. The encrypted message was not filed. It was not sent up the chain of command. It did not require debate. Air superiority is complete was not a threat. It was a statement of fact, the kind of sentence that did not need witnesses to be true. Inside the command bunker beneath the city, officers spoke in muted tones. Some drank. Some stared at walls marked with lines that no longer meant anything. Maps had once been predictions. Now they were only records of where the war had already passed through. The general watched them from the edge of the room as if observing men from another life. The Luftwaffe had been built on motion, on reaction, on speed, and now motion itself had betrayed them. He ordered a full intelligence cross-check of the Mustang formations observed over Berlin, not because he believed it would change anything, but because he needed to understand how far ahead the enemy truly was. Reports came back in fragments. Production data intercepted from American factories. Shipping routes guarded by fleets that Germany could no longer track. New pilot rotations arriving faster than replacements could be trained. The war was no longer fought in months. It was being fought in minutes. And Germany had run out of them. The most disturbing discovery did not come from intercepted radio signals. It came from a photograph. An intelligence officer slid the print across the desk without speaking. The image had been captured by a civilian camera in the Western District as the Mustangs passed low. One aircraft filled the frame. Its fuselage shone with factory-clean metal. Its markings were sharp. The general leaned in close, his fingertip hovering a hair's breadth above the paper. The squadron marking matched one he had seen through his binoculars, but the number attached to it belonged to a unit that did not yet officially exist. The general closed his eyes, not in fear, but in calculation. This was not merely a technological advantage. This was industrial inevitability. The enemy was not improvising anymore. They were manufacturing outcomes. They were not responding to Germany's moves. They were setting the calendar of the war. Outside, Berlin burned in smaller, quieter ways now. Factories flickered instead of exploded. Streets emptied instead of collapsed. The violence had grown sparse, not because peace had come, but because resistance had run out of material to burn. At midnight, a communication arrived from the western perimeter. One last reconnaissance unit had managed to get airborne. Its mission was simple in wording and impossible in execution. Track the departing Mustangs. Confirm their base of origin. The pilot was young. His aircraft was old. The sky belonged to someone else. He never returned. By morning, word spread quietly through what remained of the air command. The Mustangs had not been intercepted. They had not been chased. They had not even been acknowledged. They had simply withdrawn across a sky no longer contested. That was when the general understood the deeper cruelty of what had happened. Berlin had not been spared out of restraint. It had been spared because there was nothing left to prove. The enemy had flown over the capital not to defeat it, but to show that defeat was already complete. And if this realization is hitting you right now, this is the moment to subscribe to WW2 Never Told German Files and tell us where you are watching from in the world. Because what is unfolding here is not just the fall of a city. It is the collapse of an era. The next message arrived before dawn, carried not by radio, but by courier, sweating beneath a coat that no longer fit the season. The general read it once, then again. Then he folded it slowly and placed it beside the leaflet map. Allied armored columns were advancing faster than projected. Bridges that should have slowed them had already been replaced. Supply routes that should have strained were flowing freely. The tempo of the war had shifted so drastically that German defenses no longer lagged behind. They simply did not exist where the enemy arrived. Speed was no longer a weapon. It was the battlefield itself. In the eastern districts, flak crews stood idle beside rusting barrels, staring into skies that no longer acknowledged them. They had trained for altitude, for formations, for shadows. Not for this. Not for fighters that came without warning and left without consequence. The general walked through one such battery as daylight broke. The men snapped to attention out of habit, not belief. He looked at their hands. Blackened knuckles. Cracked skin. Men who had fought the sky and lost without ever seeing the enemy that finally ended it. He did not tell them the truth. Not because it was classified, but because it would have broken what little remained of the illusion that they were still defending something. By afternoon, rumors moved faster than official orders. Civilians spoke in hushed groups about silver birds that carried no death, about maps raining from the clouds, about a war that had become a message instead of a battle. The truth moved faster when there was nothing left to contradict it. Inside the command structure, arguments ignited. Some demanded retaliation. Others demanded negotiation. A few demanded silence. None of them controlled the sky anymore. Their voices carried no weight beyond the walls that heard them. Late that evening, the general received the second photograph. This one had been captured at extreme range. The Mustang formation withdrawing toward the west. The setting sun had caught them at an angle that turned their wings into blades of fire. Even in retreat, they looked untouchable. On the edge of the frame, barely visible, a single German aircraft had attempted to follow. The wreckage was discovered hours later. The general turned the photograph face down. His thoughts returned to the boy he had once trained. The pilots who had marched with pride beneath banners that now meant nothing. The children who had once built gliders from scraps and watched the sky with dreams that no longer belonged to them. This was not how wars were supposed to end. There was supposed to be an explosion, a surrender, a final charge, something loud enough to match the years of noise that came before it. Instead, the war was ending the way it had just passed over Berlin, quietly, effortlessly, without resistance. And yet something inside the general refused to settle. The message had been clear, the dominance undeniable, the outcome inevitable. But the question that clawed at him did not concern victory or defeat. It concerned intention. Why had the Mustangs revealed everything? Why show the map? Why reveal future squadrons? Why demonstrate power instead of using it? Wars were not won through exhibitions. They were won through annihilation, unless annihilation was no longer required. Another report arrived after nightfall. Civilian intercepts, whispered accounts, Allied broadcasts clipped at the edges, but deciphered enough to carry meaning. The enemy was already speaking of reconstruction, of industries repurposed, of skies filled with transport instead of fighters, of a Europe that would rebuild faster than Germany could recover from the silence left behind. The general leaned back in his chair and stared at the ceiling. The war had not ended with Berlin's destruction. It had ended with Berlin becoming irrelevant. And that was the cruelest victory of all. If the capital could be spared, then the capital had no leverage left. The war no longer needed symbols. It had replaced them with timelines and production curves and fuel consumption charts. That night, as the city slept beneath a wounded sky, the general stood alone by the window of his office. The forest beyond Grunewald was dark again. The tower was empty. The binoculars lay untouched. The future no longer required observation. It was already here. And if stories like this pull you deeper into the moments history never explained, now is the moment to subscribe to WW2 Never Told German Files and tell us in the comments where you are watching from. Because what is coming next is the most haunting truth of all. The final realization did not arrive with an order. It arrived with silence. No enemy aircraft appeared the following day. No bombers. No fighters. Nothing. The sky remained empty. That more than anything told him the war was over. Not because the enemy had withdrawn, but because they no longer needed to return. As night fell again, the general reached for the insignia he had set aside. For a moment, he considered fastening it back into place, just to feel its weight again, just to remember when symbols still mattered. He left it where it was. The city outside did not cheer. It did not collapse. It did not surrender. It simply waited. And in that waiting, a deeper fear took root. Because now the question was no longer when Berlin would fall. It was what would rise in its place, and whether the Mustangs had been carrying a warning or a promise. Morning came without ceremony. No sirens. No engines. No distant thunder of artillery to announce another day of resistance. Berlin woke beneath an empty sky that felt wider than it ever had before. The absence of sound pressed heavier than any bombardment. Silence, once rare, had become the loudest signal of all. From his office window, the general watched civilians move through the streets below. Some carried buckets. Some carried sacks. Some carried nothing at all but the slow weight of survival. No one looked up anymore. The sky had ceased to be a battlefield. It had become something far more terrifying. It had become uncontested. Inside the bunker, the command staff waited for orders that never came. Telephones remained untouched. Radios stayed dark. A war built on reaction had finally reached a moment where nothing remained to react to. Germany was still fighting yesterday's war, while tomorrow's war had already passed overhead and moved on. Shortly after noon, the final confirmation arrived. Allied armor divisions had crossed the last defensive lines west of the city. Resistance had fractured into isolated pockets of delay, not defense. Supply routes once thought unreachable had been converted into highways of steel. The momentum was no longer measured in kilometers per week. It was measured in hours. The general read the report once and placed it atop the others without comment. The Mustangs had not merely demonstrated air superiority. They had shown what came after air superiority. Speed without friction. Power without interruption. A war no longer shaped by battles, but by logistics and certainty. For the first time, he considered the possibility that Berlin's fate had already been written weeks earlier. Perhaps months. Perhaps even before the Mustangs ever crossed the Atlantic in numbers no one in Germany could match. The truth settled slowly and mercilessly. The war had ended in the factories long before it ended in the streets. As dusk crept into the city again, the general returned to the tower for the final time. The forest below was calm. The wind moved gently through stripped branches like fingers brushing scars. He climbed the steps alone, each footfall echoing in the concrete shaft that no longer needed guards or observers. At the top, the binoculars still rested where he had last left them. He lifted them once more, not expecting to see anything. The sky remained empty. Yet as he scanned the horizon, his gaze drifted west, toward where the Mustangs had disappeared, toward a world that was already reorganizing itself beyond the reach of what remained of Germany's war machine. In that direction lay the future, and it no longer belonged to men who measured power by fear alone. Behind him, the city whispered with the sounds of survival. Fires burning for warmth instead of destruction. Footsteps moving without panic. Voices that spoke quietly, not in command, but in uncertainty. His thoughts returned again to the map that had fallen from the sky. Every secret exposed. Every illusion stripped away. Wars were supposed to be contests of strength. This had been a declaration of inevitability. Back in his office, the insignia still lay where he had placed it. This time he picked it up. The metal felt lighter than it once had. He turned it over in his palm, studying the eagle he had once worn with pride and certainty. The symbol of a force that had dominated the skies of Europe. The emblem of victories that now felt like they belonged to another man. He did not destroy it. He did not hide it. He simply set it back down. That night, the final radio transmission from the Western Front arrived. Short, unemotional, no code, no flourish. Berlin would soon be surrounded. The war, in practical terms, was finished. Yet even in that moment of total clarity, the general could not escape the unanswered question that gnawed deeper than defeat. Why had Berlin been spared that day? The Mustangs had possessed every advantage. Altitude, speed, numbers, surprise, firepower beyond anything the Luftwaffe could answer. A single pass by bombers could have erased entire districts. The capital could have been reduced to smoke and ashen hours. Instead, they had delivered paper, knowledge, exposure. It was as if the enemy had wanted Germany to see its own defeat before it physically arrived. To understand not just that it would lose, but that it already had. The war had ended first in the mind. Days later, as Allied forces closed in and Berlin prepared for surrender, rumors began to surface among intelligence circles. Whispers of plans beyond the battlefield. Of skies filled not with fighters, but with cargo aircraft. Of nations already mapping reconstruction, while bombs still lay unexploded. The general listened without comment. He had already seen the proof. On the wings of the Mustangs that carried markings from a future Germany no longer controlled. On the maps that exposed secrets no one should have known. On the silence that followed where once there had been fire. In the final hours before Berlin's fall, he returned one last time to the window. The city glowed dimly beneath cloud cover. No alarm sounded. No formations crossed overhead. The war had retreated not in violence, but in quiet withdrawal. He realized then what the demonstration had truly been. It was not a warning to Berlin. It was a message to history. This was how wars would be fought now. Not through occupation first. Not through annihilation first. But through dominance so complete that destruction became optional. Years later, documents would be found. Production logs. Deployment schedules. Communications that confirmed what the general had sensed in those final days. The enemy had reached a point where victory no longer depended on cities falling. It depended on skies remaining permanently inaccessible to the defeated. Air supremacy had become permanent supremacy, and Berlin had been spared not out of mercy, but because mercy had become unnecessary. The city would fall anyway, just slower, just quieter, without the spectacle that once defined war. The last night passed without incident. No aircraft, no guns, no sirens, only wind through broken streets, and the distant murmur of soldiers preparing to lay down arms they could no longer use. The general sat alone at his desk as the final hours slipped past. The insignia rested before him. The maps lay folded beside it. The message from the enemy, etched not in ink but in inevitability, had already reshaped the meaning of victory. When dawn came again, it came to a city that no longer belonged to the sky. And somewhere far beyond Berlin, Mustangs continued to fly under markings that once had no enemy left to fear. The war ended not with thunder, but with certainty. And even now, decades later, historians continue to debate whether the sparing of Berlin was a calculated act of psychological warfare, or the quiet opening chapter of a world where victory no longer required destruction. The sky kept its secret, the city kept its scars, and the moment the general realized the war was over remains one of the most haunting unanswered questions of the entire conflict. If the Mustangs had already won the sky, why did they choose that moment to show it? And if this story stayed with you, if it made you feel the weight of those final quiet hours, then subscribe to WW2 Never Told German Files and tell us in the comments where you're watching from in the world. These untold moments only survive because you keep them alive.